Okay, you saw Donald Trump with Mark Rutte there. That's because NATO leaders have signed on to a new spending target today. There they are, promising to spend 5% of GDP on defense by 2035. And this is all going to lead to a major ramp up for the militaries of NATO members, something NATO Secretary General credits U.S. President Donald Trump with achieving, texting Trump yesterday saying, "You are flying into another big success in The Hague this evening. It was not easy, but we've got them all signed on to 5%. So what does this mean for Canada? Well, Canada has failed to spend the 2% target on defense for years now, but Prime Minister Mark Carney has promised to get there by next March in 2026. But now the bar is being raised even higher.
5% of our GDP would be about $150 billion.
I mean, that's a lot.
It's a lot of numbers.
Per year?
Per year.
That's a lot.
Of course, it
so
is
it
a
means
lot.
It is a lot. $150 billion is a lot of money to spend every year on the military, but the new rules from NATO split that 5% into two spending buckets. You've got 3.5%, or about $107 billion for Canada in today's numbers. That will go directly to things like jets, submarines, weapons, salaries, and training. But the other 1.5%, or about $43 billion, can be invested in defense-related infrastructure, things such as ports, airfields, or roads in the Arctic, or roads that get to critical mineral projects that have a military use. Prime Minister Mark Carney says NATO's new target was chosen to address new security threats and challenges.
The threats to our own sovereignty are becoming more acute. With increasingly open Arctic waters and rapid advances in cyber, in AI, and quantum, with advanced missile capacities, we can no longer rely on our geography to protect us. So together with our allies, we must ensure that NATO remains strong, unified, and ready to confront the threats not just of today, but of tomorrow.
Guy Thibault is former Vice Chief of the Defense Staff, and he joins me now. Guy Thibault, it's good to see you again. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you, David.
You can see where 5% makes sense for NATO, for the alliance, to keep Donald Trump happy. Does it make sense for Canada right now?
Well, I think that increased defense spending certainly makes a lot of good sense for Canada. I think we've recognized that for some time. And I think that a commitment to continue to invest in Canada's defense and national security is really, really important. So I think this does fit in that overall kind of narrative.
So right now, Canada has a plan to get to 2%. It still hasn't hit 2%. That's going to happen at the end of this fiscal year if everything goes to plan. And with defense spending, things don't always go to plan. How easy do you think it will be to get to 3.5% on core defense by 2035, then plus another 1.5% on defense infrastructure and other things to get to that total of 5%?
Well, I think first and foremost, it won't be easy. I think that when we kind of look at that level of additional investment above, our historic investment in Canada will require decisions to be made and choices to be made by the government, and those won't be easy choices, I don't think. Having said that, the capability needs, I think, are easily identifiable. And when the government laid out its defense policy in our north, strong and free, and a focus on Canada's far north and really sovereignty, the capabilities to do that, I think, are really expensive capabilities. So I think that when it comes to the defense and security needs, 5% actually isn't really all that hard to imagine why that would be important. But I do think that it's going to be hard to get there.
Well, you're talking $110 billion in today's numbers on direct defense spending, and then another $40-50 billion on indirect defense spending. When you got an annual budget as a country of about $400 billion, you're talking a big share of it. But it seems to me, if you look at the economic agenda being outlined by this government to do dual purpose infrastructure in the north, you're going to get double credit for a lot of things, right? You're going to get economic opportunity on critical minerals and other natural resource projects that you can also count towards your defense spending. So there's a marriage here of the industrial policy and the defense policy, at least in some cases. Is there not?
Absolutely. And defense spending versus defense investment. I think all of us who work in defense like to really reflect on these as investments in Canada, in our capabilities and our ability to respond to crisis at home and or abroad. And you don't need to be following the issues of the Canadian Forces too closely to know that the Canadian Forces continue to be our firefighters, both internationally and literally here at home. So we are investing in capabilities that can do a whole range of things, from search and rescue to making sure we can guard our maritime domains, to contributing to international peace and security, continuing to train Ukrainian forces involved in frontline response in Europe in view of Russia's aggression with NATO. So we are investing in those kind of capabilities, and I think you're right that the dual use of that which is good for Canada's defence and security is also good, I think, economically for Canadians as well.
There are some big ticket items that need to be purchased between now and 2035, or at least the purchases need to be completed and finally decided on, the F-35s being the most imminent one, with the Prime Minister saying the review they're doing of that contract will be done by the end of the summer. Billions there, either F-35s or an alternative, depending on where it goes. There's a sub-purchase that the country needs to make a decision on, certainly by the end of 2028. 3 oceans, 4 subs, and one of them working. Not a great situation. So those are things that we know are coming that would help push the number a whole lot higher, right? Without necessarily having to make additional choices, at least in the initial term.
I think that in the last 2 governments' policies that were announced, Strong, Secure, Engage and Our North, Strong and Free, they actually laid out a pretty compelling case for the world that's changing around us, why it's changing and what we need to do to adapt. And there was a long laundry list of things that needed to be done in order to do that adaptation, just for national defense. And the other security agencies, whether it be CSIS, whether it be the Communications Security Establishment, looking at transport and borders, there's a lot to be done to take care of the kind of threats that we see, the kind of security challenges that we see in Canada today. And so, you know, from all of that perspective, I do think that you're right. There's some big ticket items that will help, but there's a wide range of capabilities that we need to actually invest in Canada. And so whether that's 5% or 3.5% or 4%,
sure.
What I think is important is that we don't get distracted by that. You know, I think that we need to actually do better with defense procurement. We need to kind of make good on our promises to support the men and women who serve in our armed forces with the kind of support that they need, the training, the equipment, the family kind of circumstances that they face, and invest in them. So there's a lot to be done, and you know, I think we just got to keep making good, steady progress, and I think that's really the important part here.
Yeah, the Prime Minister even kind of said that today, you know, and through leading up to today, while committing to a percentage target, saying you don't just want to look at that number and work backwards. You want to start building on what you need, assess your capacity, and see where you are. And that's why there's a 2029 review on this. But it includes other things now in the accounting. For example, CSE and CSIS, right? The security establishment and the spy agency, some of their efforts may be included in this because it is security spending. Support for Ukraine is included because that is collective security spending. So there might be credit here for things that weren't given credit for in the past. But I wonder, the process here, the commitment to hit a big new ambitious target, 11 years after the last time we committed to one that we're still not on track to, well, we still haven't hit yet. I mean, is there a cart before the horse kind of process happening here? What are the bottlenecks and tripwires on the road here?
Well, in some respects, yes. I think, you know, having kind of declared that we're going to be spending and investing this kind of part of our national treasure without having a foreign policy, without having a national security strategy, I think we're going to need to have an updated defense policy that really provides, I guess, the wayposts for us towards 5%. I know the government is working on that, a new defense industrial strategy. So, you know, I think we need to have a little bit of patience with the government. I think it's great to see, the Prime Minister leading on this file, and that's something that's quite different, I think, from historically. We haven't always seen kind of the executive kind of leadership pulling on these issues. And so I think it's a good opportunity in a very worrisome world. So it's good news on one side that we're paying attention to this. It's kind of bad news that we have to pay attention to these issues, because that's where the hard choices are going to come, how we're actually going to really afford to do this over the long term.
Well, that's just where I wanted to go on the final point, because, look, Donald Trump and the lessened reliability of the United States is a key motivating factor here. The ground war in Europe with Russia and Ukraine, key motivating factor here. But you're right, the Prime Minister is driving it. But he's also warning of like sacrifices and choices potentially down the road as the dollar amount goes up, and maybe the role of the federal government has to pull back in other areas. He's got to bring the Canadian public along if it becomes a net zero-sum game in terms of where money goes and where it doesn't go on programs and other opportunities.
I think that if you're in Taiwan or Poland or Lithuania or Finland, you see the world very differently than I think Canadians on average do. But I think all Canadians should be paying attention to a very worrisome world in the way it's turning, and Canada is not really well adapted or prepared for it. And we have some real threats at home, and we're no longer invulnerable to these kind of threats, whether it be in the cyber context, whether it be looking at the effects of climate change and disasters that are increasingly apparent and needing response. And so I think that we can't take anything for granted, and I think that this is it's the right moment, I think, for Canada to step up here, and this is one way to do it.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Guy Thibault, former Vice Chief of the Defence Staff. Always appreciate the time. Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, the Power Panel joins me now to talk about all of this. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communications strategist and co-host of the Beyond the Ballot podcast. Brad Levine is a former national campaign director for the NDP. And here with me in the studio, Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties. It's good to see you all. Happy Wednesday. Happy NATO Commitment Day. Let's call it that. Look, Tim, the 5% target is the headline, but I'm really struck by what Mark Carney said there at the end of that clip we played. He said, if we are moving to the higher and higher levels of defense spending because that's necessary, then we will have to make considerations about what less the federal government can do in certain cases and how we're going to pay for it. That signals a big change in what the federal government might be doing over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's the first time it's been voiced, but I think a lot of people understand that if they just look at the math. I mean, the spending they're talking about is equivalent to what we spent in 1939 and 1942, I believe, in terms of the ramp up. Ramp up. And I think, was it David Perry at the Canadian Defence Institute made the point that, look, Prime Minister, the work the Prime Minister probably has ahead is convincing Canadians that this is going to be a sustaining investment over time. I think right now we all get it, and I think there's an argument to be made that it's important. I think part of the argument he's going to have to make is also there's benefit here, not just in safety and security to Canada, but economic opportunity here. I think he's tried to lay the groundwork for some of that, but let's not kid ourselves. That means some services that people get now they're not likely to get if the focus suddenly becomes defense. And what, David, it was only a few years ago we were sitting here in the pandemic talking about how we had to maximize spending on long-term care, how we had to maximize spending we do every year on health care. We can't spend in all these areas. So Prime Minister has some early credibility I think he can use if he wants to make the case for this, but it's going to have to be sustaining if they want it to continue. The other thing I'd say quickly is that 2029 date, which he laughed off when he said, 2029, the review date.
Will Trump be gone then? Yeah.
Donald Trump is gone then. What does it look like in 5 years, but what happens in the interim period?
Yeah, and look, the whole threat environment, security environment, everything could be different, and you do want to have check-ins with these things. It is prudent planning, but you're right. The President of the United States, if the Constitution is followed, will be a different guy. But Amanda, on this, the $150 billion that we're looking at, that's today's numbers. It'll be much larger by 2035 because the economy, hopefully, will be larger, and just as a share, it goes up. But this will make defense, if the other things sort of stay where they are proportionally, the single biggest line item in the federal budget, for a single project, because right now it's like transfers to people, like seniors and stuff. This will eclipse OAS and all of those things. This is about a third of federal spending. If we go to this number as a country, keeping people on board with that as it happens is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. It was interesting. And we were looking at Angus Reid had a survey out, and they were looking at public opinion on this particular issue and defense spending in general. And I think it's up to 51% of Canadians said that they would support the 2% target, and 17% said they would support even more. But what I found fascinating about those numbers was that they've doubled from a year ago. So the trajectory of public opinion going up and being okay with this idea of increased spending has really been aligned with the threat. And when the threat to our sovereignty and our security, which is, the Prime Minister started his job in the face of this global instability. So, but he's looking down at this global instability, and he has behind him, an armed force that has been chronically underfunded, infrastructure that is decaying, and looking at equipment that is either non-existent or needs to be upgraded. So his job in the face of these threats is to make the case to Canadians who seem to be moving in that direction. They're on side with this idea of spending more. And now he has another decade to see how does this threat either increase or dissipate. And at that 2029 mark, when we take a look at those targets, is it still necessary to have that 5%, or are we in a different frame?
Right. So, Brad, I'm making notes here in an orange marker. So I'm thinking about all those New Democrat voters that you and others like to remind me lent their vote to the Liberals in this election. Yeah. How do you think they're feeling about the idea of an increase to $150 billion a year in today's dollars and potentially squeezing out other government services, programs, or the size of the civil service as a result?
That's going to be the debate in the coming short to medium term. Just to put it in perspective, because 5% sounds, that's not too much. When you look at it, it's a nickel out of a dollar. Okay, fair enough. Currently, this fiscal year, the federal government is transferring, in all transfers to the provinces and territories, it's $103 billion. So this, our 3.5% commitment that he made today is larger than what we're transferring from Ottawa to the provinces for healthcare, for this Canada Social Transfer, for equalization, which helps provinces under a certain threshold make sure that they can provide services to individual Canadians, as well as the territorial transfers. So the easy part is today, being at the NATO building, signing, being on the world stage, having Canada fulfill its NATO commitment, and being part of the unanimous endorsement of this new target. So this is going to be tough, because it's not going to be over the next 24 hours, it's going to be the difficult choices. It's going to be the budgets in subsequent fiscal years, unless he wants to tack it on to the larger deficit, to borrow the money for this. He's going to have to make some difficult choices, and the biggest tickets from where he can take it is going to be in transfers that people rely on. So the interesting part will also be that the 1.5%, the dual purpose ones, the things like ports, roads. Look for Carney to emphasize that aspect of the commitment today, because Canadians do want to see infrastructure improvements. Our ports are in desperate need of infrastructure. Our airports, ask anybody that travels, desperately needed. And the infrastructure to get to those big ticket things that he passed in C5. That is getting the roadways to the mines for things like critical minerals. There's going to be tremendous public support for that. New Democrats, it was interesting in that Angus Reid poll that Amanda referenced, over half of New Democrats support the 2%, but it precipitously drops off the minute you talk about more. So he's got a heck of a selling job to do in the near and medium term.
Well, Brad, I'm glad you tied all those things together, because we're not even 2 months since the election, and you can see, Tim, all the different things Mark Carney has been highlighting coming together in the defense and industrial policy marrying together. But this is $411 million a day in defense spending if you hit the target by 2030.
Basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm half of the total CBC budget.
That aside, and with respect to the sizzling 7 of the NDP, right now he's got the political he has the political support in Parliament to do this. Very hard for the Conservatives to go against this. This has been a central plank of what Conservatives have been saying for years: safety, security, and investment. So, he's got a window, again, for this particular envelope over the next 18 months to make commitments around what he can do there. Though, history is always instructive in these circumstances. I can't think of a government in a period like this who hasn't said they were going to increase defense spending and did. Then at a certain point, political pressure outside forced change. I mean, we haven't seen spending like 5% since the 1950s. When was that? After the Cold War, when things like this were still a threat. I think the opportunity, though, for Carney and perhaps for the Conservatives is, all right, does this spending lead to economic return in Canada? Does it create our own military-industrial complex, which will drive some Canadians batty, but in the same time create economic opportunity. I think that's a way he can spin it. I think as long as Trump is there, as long as Putin is there, the public will still be there. But though, as you suggest, Trump may want to stay for a third term and Putin may want to stay forever, 5 years it may be very different.
But, you know, man, I look at this and I look at the federal spending power being eaten up, so much of it, by this commitment. And, you know, this is not an assessment of the rightness or wrongness of this. This is just what it is. And I look at how it's been the last 10 years, particularly with Prime Minister Trudeau, and the provinces all sort of like pulling back their fiscal capacity by cutting taxes and user fees and license plate fees, and then counting on Ottawa to fill the gap. Ottawa's not going to be able to do that if this is the path. It's going to put a bit of pressure, download a lot of it, to the premiers who ultimately are responsible for it constitutionally, and they're not going to have to pay for it financially.
For sure, but everything has changed, right? The entire world has changed. It's been a seismic change, and I think, you know, the premiers have also moved the needle a lot. And I think that where public opinion lands on this will dictate how the premiers also respond. I mean, what is the alternative? The NATO allies come to the table. They say, we're going to meet this 5% commitment. We know because we've had a specific threat to our sovereignty, and we're going to walk away from that table saying, you know, sorry, we're not going to show up right now. You just have to look at how public opinion has changed in a year's time to know that it's possible to get the public on side with something like this. I mean, the point that Carney made today, which I thought was, you know, so important, was that we may have to make sacrifices down the road, and those sacrifices could come, you know, in 10 years' time. But we've been making sacrifices already. We've been making sacrifices in, you know, in our armed forces, in our infrastructure, in our equipment. Those sacrifices have been made. Now the pendulum needs to swing again.
Well, the CAF is certainly, the Canadian Armed Forces has certainly made the sacrifice, right? And they are owed good kit and good salaries, and certainly that's the starting point of this. Brad, last word on this, and then I want to move on to the next topic. Just close the loop for us.
Well, I think there'll be an interesting time. That's a lot of money, and it's very quickly. And we saw, like in the pandemic, for example, a lot of money went out quickly. This is size, roughly the similar sizes, not perfectly equal, but it's the closest thing I think we have in recent memory. The key, in addition to finding out where the money is going to come from and what the political risks are there. So Amanda asks, well, we had no choice. I'd like to. You had an option, sir. It was echoing in the back of my mind as she was saying, "What else could we do? We had no option." But the difficult choices are going to have to come, and it's going to be part of the political discourse, especially at the provincial level, because they are going to be the main recipients of the pain. Obviously, individual Canadians will feel the pain, but it's the provinces who are going to have to manage that pain. It's also how that money gets spent. If it has to be done quickly, on what does it get spent precisely? How is procurement done? And is this government going to get it right for the first time in our recent history to get defense procurement right, where there's actually outcomes to the amount of money that gets spent? I think those are a lot of things that Canadians are going to be looking at after the numbers and the sticker shock sets in.
Right.